A great rankings debate. Celebrating me finally getting my rankings out this week by talking through some similarities and some differences in both mine and Sean's rankings. That's what we're going to be doing on today's episode of Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find the newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz. And Sean, I always write about this. It's a little bit of a background for listeners to understand sort of, I guess, the point of this, why I introduced it to you as an idea for this week. And it's this idea that I haven't looked at your rankings yet. I haven't, and yours are my favorite in the entire industry of anyone else, but I haven't looked at anyone else's either. I stole this quote, not to be too dramatic, but I stole this quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson in one of my recent write-ups in the rankings release, that genius is always sufficiently the enemy of genius by over-influence. And it's this idea that if you want to get something really useful and interesting out of your own thoughts, it's hard to do that when you've looked at other people's that you respect, strong takes and things like that. And so I always do that. I've talked about it in past years where I don't look at others' rankings. Obviously, I'm aware of your rankings. We've done drafts together where you've had them uploaded. I've seen like elements of it, but sitting there and really digging into where you have guys tiered out and stuff, I didn't want to be too influential into my own ranking process, because I think there's something really interesting in where we might land, because we do obviously talk about a lot of this stuff and have a similar process, but where we might land in actually tiering them out and where the differences might lie. And to start this show, or before starting the show, we're just talking a little bit. I had intended to kind of go through and prepare a little bit better. I have not gotten through all your rankings yet. I have a couple small notes that I noticed from this morning before we were scheduled to record, but I also did some other writing this morning. So from my end, some of this is going to be me looking at your ranks sort of live, and just warning the listeners of that. I think it's true on your end as well. So we were talking a little bit before the show and already starting to find things that were interesting. I really liked your Cooper Kupp ranking. I was asking you how you were responding to the Puka Nacua, injury news, and some of those elements are already going to be influential. And one of the things we often hear is we should just record our pre-show conversations and those things. So we decided, rather than spending an hour or an hour and a half talking about all of this before the show and then trying to restate it on the show, that we would just kind of let it go, let it flow a little bit. Maybe less of a prepared show today, but maybe more of a raw and reactionary show. That the whole idea of this, hopefully, is that you are getting a sort of a range of outcomes element from two people that have very similar process. As you said to me, before, there's this, and I've been so excited to talk to you about it because I care so much about how you get to your conclusions. So much of that is going to be similar, but then, if they're going to differ, why? Because so much of the foundational stuff is going to be similar. And you're saying to me before that it's in many ways more enjoyable to have these types of conversations with people that are, that think similarly to you.
And so much of that is because, you will occasionally have, still good conversations, but conversations with analysts who are either A, trying to accomplish something very different structurally, B, have a very different player evaluation rubric, C, see the role or influence of projections in a different way, or D, maybe have some contacts that you don't have access to and, don't know how much to trust. And, occasionally you'll hear notes from people where they're like, well, this is kind of an insider take that we want to make sure we're reflecting in some way, shape, or form to our subscribers. And I don't necessarily disagree with doing that, but it's also something where if it's kind of a black box, you're like, there's no interaction that can happen there. It's just a matter of, maybe someone with the team. But Ben, we've had, and I certainly wouldn't say that I have a ton of contacts in the league, but it's interesting when you do talk to some people in the league, some of the things that you hear, some of it can be very useful. Some of it can, you tend to prioritize information in certain ways, and sometimes if it comes closer to the people who are actually in the thick of it, then you'll feel like the priority should be there, as opposed to all the work that you've done on analyzing the players, what you know about the players past, all of those types of things. One thing that we do know is that coaches can be wrong, right? And the same types of things that you get as a team progresses through training camp and then the early weeks and the second half of the season, often what the coach will come to is that the player's background and their previous production is pretty meaningful, and we should be playing the best guys, not a guy who flashed in a way that doesn't really matter in practice or ingratiated himself to the coaching staff. Not that there's a huge influence there, but just we're people, right? And even in I often kind of reference that right out of college I did some tennis coaching, and there are very human decisions that are made that influence things in ways that are positive, negative, what have you. You step back, and certainly these NFL teams are dealing with a lot of players. They're dealing with a very complex sport in terms of what's happening on any given play. I do think that defaulting to what we know about the players from a profile perspective is important, and then how all of those things come into play. So that's kind of sets the stage for some of the discussion that we're having. And certainly when you and I are in a different place on a guy, that for me is very interesting. I also want to say, as we start out here, that Ben, I'm fired up to get your rankings. Your rankings always have this sort of magic to them, some mystique, some intrigue. You release them late. People are always waiting for them. You don't have to necessarily live with all the previous mistakes that you made throughout the ranking season. I've mentioned to you that when you're working through and you realize you've been wrong on a ranking, then you do have to change it. But there's always this kind of regret. The people who drafted off of your previous rank and have the wrong player, you feel some responsibility to them.
And you love to say that, or you've mentioned to me at least before, that means that you're wrong either way, right? So like once you make the change, you were either too low earlier or too high now later. You're gonna be wrong to some group of people. So a lot of people just stick with that take because they're like, well, I've been high on this guy the whole time. I can't admit it now because then I'm definitely wrong about something, and there's still a chance that this can pan out. So I need to stay on high on this guy. This is the biggest reason, Shawn, that I'm late with releasing my ranks. Is the years that I would do it early, I found myself getting too much take lock, and that's just more of a personal thing in terms of how I work. As an analyst, it's harder for me to be as fluid as I think you would need to be. People like you are I think, sharper at that. But yeah, knowing that about myself, I wait until I feel like I have the entirety of the information. And for me, it's until I get through the entire projections process and weigh in the real, numbers based stuff. Cause I don't want early takes to influence the way that I dig into the projections as well. I don't emphasize the projections, but I don't want my projections to be overly biased either. I want to go into those with as much of an independent mind as I can, because a lot of the projections decisions do amount to whether you're high on a player and you think he can earn a lot of volume or those types of things. And so it's it's a process that's worked for me over the last few years. I appreciate you saying that there's like an intrigue to it. It's more just by necessity. It's not that I'm like holding something back necessarily, but
I think that after you've gone through the process that you have, where you do the ceiling signals posts, you work through all the teams, you work through all the projections, you talk through all of that with our buddy Mike Leone, who is obviously absolutely fantastic. And after you've gone through that process, then the rankings that you come out with are going to be good. And certainly for anybody who doesn't know, it adds to, I think, the value of those, the respect that we all have for those that you have been very successful in the last several years with the high stakes formats as well. I always kind of push back at this idea that the rankings need to be, or that rankings accuracy is the only thing, because one of the things you're trying to encourage people to think through are ranges of outcome and structure and which types of players are landmines, which types of players have upside, and trying to minimize your mistakes can actually hurt your subscribers. At the same time, if you're not using your own rankings to have success in meaningful contests, then they're probably not as valuable to listeners either. And certainly you've done a fantastic job. So Ben, let's jump into
that's the whole goal, right? We should start talking about the actual ranks, but I think this conversation is really interesting, and that's the whole goal. Is to I joked about it in my write-up, but my goal is to make sure that every single person who uses my ranks at every single one of their draft selections has the exact pick that I would make at the top of their rankings every single time. That's a pretty lofty goal. It's not actually going to happen, but that's the goal. I mean, that's the intent behind rankings. We've talked, you and I, about how rankings are a really tough thing to do because, I mean, I certainly am not going to stand behind where I have every single one of these players ordinarily ranked. If somebody asks me, what about this player versus this player? It's probably going to make me reconsider whether I have that accurate or not, if I really want to stand by that or not. It's difficult to go through the whole rankings process and get every single decision into a place where you're like, this is where I would do it when I was on the clock, etc. And then for me, as I said, I haven't looked at anyone else's rankings when I put that all together. Obviously, I'm very aware of, guys you're high on and things like that. But I want to put it together in a way that I think is indicative of what I feel about all of these. And then between now and week 1, I'm going to make a ton of rankings updates. And after this conversation today, certainly going to make some, because there's always that balance of, you want it to be independent and your own opinion. At the same time, I have a ton of respect for you. I have a ton of respect for a lot of other intelligent analysts in the industry. So the trade-off when I'm not looking at everyone else's ranks is the reason I keep mentioning this is I feel like I'm missing out on valuable information that I should be including. I'm not so hubristic to think that I have a better opinion than everyone on every single player. That's crazy, right? And so there's a really important balance there where you want to take in outside information, but you also want to try to maintain, if you think it's a smart contrarian play for your own rankings, for people who are listening who might look at our ranking, Sean, but be making their own and making their own decisions, certainly, if you think you see something or you have something on a player, like, you need to have conviction in that. At the same time, the reason you're listening to the pod here today, the reason you might be reflecting our rankings, is you probably respect our opinions. And that is also valuable as well. I mean, it's a combination of both things. The last thing before we jump into the ranking, Sean, I want to mention, you guys do awesome stuff over at RotoViz. You like to do it tiers based. All of your rankings are available at RotoViz. Mine are available at the newsletter at bengresh.substack.com. I got asked about whether my ranks would be over at RotoViz. They're always at the newsletter, all my written content at the newsletter. So they are 2 separate subscriptions in that regard. But just to clarify that for anyone who is confused. But yours is tiers-based, mine are tiers-based. We both like to think in terms of grouping players together as well. And then one of the big things that you start to think about as we talk through these debates is what type of a tier some of these players are in. When you're down on a guy, where does he fall to? I'm very low on Saquon. Sean, you're very low on Saquon. We've talked about him. I got asked about my rankings release, why I have him down in a tier with Josh Jacobs and Joe Mixon. And I talked through that, and I was like, I feel like that's a really good spot for him, honestly, because I think the Jacobs and Mixon situations are a little bit more pass volume potential with the lack of mobility at QB, but they're big upside offenses where those guys could be carried along a little bit, but through big workloads. To me, they're kind of dead zone-y backs. And Saquon actually, I think, has less of an upside case in that regard in terms of what his workload could be with the receiving and the big, value for, I mean, both Jacobs and Mixon could have the potential for some big touchdowns if things really ran a certain way for them. And so I talked through that and I was like, setting aside Saquon's ADP, that's about, I think, the class that he belongs in. And so that kind of tiers-based thinking, there's more thoughts on that over at the newsletter in a post I sent out today that did not have a paywall for those who just want to, read more thoughts on that particular topic. But yeah, that type of tiers-based thinking can help you question when you're down on a guy, how far down on him you may be, or whether that's far enough, frankly. So anyway, that was just a little bit more groundwork that I thought was intriguing. But yeah, let's jump into some of the
Barkley is it's kind of interesting because you have that question when you're really down on someone who is provocative or controversial or what have you, like how low do you want to move them? Because you really, all you need to do for your subscribers is to move him out of the range where they could take it. And you're going to look worse if you move him way down and you end up being wrong. But for myself, I think it still makes sense to reflect where you are on a player, even if you could have just moved them down to a range where people aren't going to take him. Giving the true rankings, I think, provides a window into how to think about the players. And you're going to be wrong occasionally, but you want to reflect the pieces of information, the context, the tactics, all of those types of things that go into a ranking, to where, the other thing is, once you've moved them down to where you're not going to take him yourself, people who are prioritizing your rankings are not going to take him. It also doesn't hurt you then to actually move him down to where you think he is, because both things are going to move him out of the target range, but the one actually provides more information, which is helpful. Again, even if you're wrong, you want to provide that window into how you're thinking about the players.
Yeah, because sometimes, one of the things we've talked about in the fantasy space this year is that the different marketplaces are, I think, widening. The difference between best ball and redraft is widening, and the ways that people view these players. A great example of this is, I thought I had a really high ranking on Jackson Smith and Jigba, and one of the questions I got after I released my rankings is, why am I so low on Jackson Smith and Jigba? So in some cases, it's all relative, and I think that person was anticipating I was going to be very, very high on JSN. I like where you have him, Shawn.
Ben, you have at 36. Why are you not higher?
Wide receiver 36, but when I weigh in the ADP element, like, I have him right ahead of George Pickens and Hollywood Brown, Shawn. Like, there are a lot of good wide receivers out there that are very
DK
drafted.
Metcalf at 21. We all know these guys are going to flip. Why have you not made that move in your rankings? Let's start with some QBs, just to make it almost an easy access into the process. We're pretty similar here. Maybe there's a tiny bit of nuance at the beginning that may or may not be interesting. You have the big four guys, and then a soft tier break, and then maybe the exciting guys. You have the three mobile QBs and Stroud. Then we have this transition tier break. The players that I think are interesting for me here is that I have Stroud up into the middle of that top group. I think that he and Patrick Mahomes offer a very similar thesis. And one of the things that I found as I was working through a piece on Jaden Daniels, basically, was more information to encourage me to move Lamar Jackson up. I do think that there is some risk with Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts, to where Mahomes and Stroud can beat them even without having historic seasons. Now, part of that is just, I think that right now for them, with the receivers they have, the median season is extremely high, which gives them more access to these upside scoring types of profiles that, for the vast majority of quarterbacks in any kind of year, if you're going to get there as a passer, you're going to have a career season, an all-time great season. I guess I don't think that that's necessarily the case for them. So I would move Stroud into that group. The other thing then for me is that I do have Jordan Love more or less in that group with the mobile QBs, the young guys. Now, he doesn't provide that type of rushing value, but it's a similar thesis for me, where you have one of the most controversial things that has occurred over the last week is that the Packers had a scrimmage, and it was very meaningful that we need to make sure we're ranking our players based on the number of snaps those guys played. That's a little bit of a joke. Obviously, how those players are being used is meaningful, right? But I think it reinforces the fact, like, if you're going to say Jaden Reed and Dontavian Wicks are in a little bit of trouble from a usage perspective, I think that, if anything, just really reiterates both the floor, the median, the high types of outcomes that a Jordan Love would have. am I too high on Stroud and Love as they mix in with these other elite quarterbacks? I mean, everybody in this group we expect to score. When you have this very sort of soft tier break in the middle, how does that manifest then in terms of how you would be wanting to target QBs in, say, redraft?
Yeah, this is a great starting point. Because Stroud is one that I can immediately be like, well, I have him ranked that tier breakdown in part because of ADP. Like I have him behind Richardson, but I like your rank. Like I have him. Sorry, he goes behind Richardson. I have him ahead of Richardson as a target. But I like your rank where you're even going further. And so it's one of these examples of a spot where it's like, yeah, I think I've maybe moved Barkley further down than you, which doesn't mean I'm lower on Barkley than you. It's just the way that we were talking through that. Like, how far do you move him down? And then you've moved Stroud higher than me. And I'm certainly not going to say that I'm not in agreement with you. I have Stroud projected to lead the NFL in passing yards. I have Mahomes as the only player relatively near him. Those two guys do profile from an efficiency and from an overall volume perspective. Like, to me, when I went and did my projections, like they can really run away with the passing numbers in a way that even in a median, in a base projection that really matters. The biggest reason I think that I left Mahomes ahead of him is when I did do these projections, I relate everything back to the market-based touchdown numbers, and the Chiefs offense is projected to be, not way better than the Texans, who are also projected to be good, but meaningfully better. When I pull it up, it looks like it's about 3.4 touchdowns on the team level for the season, offensive touchdowns better. That's the market expectation. Although early in the offseason, even before the Stephon Diggs trade, I had the Stealing Line subscribers take the Houston Texans as, I think they're about plus 150 to win their division, and then also as a longer shot Super Bowl contender, because I was arguing at the time that they were the biggest threat to the Chiefs in the AFC. And I certainly still believe that now that they've added Diggs and done the things that they did in the offseason. They're in that rookie QB window. Stroud's that good. So they're an obvious team that could overperform this market-based expected TDs number. I'm maybe too tied into where the projections came out, which is higher on the TD side than Mahomes, meaningfully enough that there's a projection gap between them. And at the same time, when I think through the stuff of like where we're at in these guys, in these teams, when I wrote up the off-season stealing signal stuff for the Chiefs just yesterday, one of the things I noted is I hear people joke about like Mahomes is going to throw 60 touchdowns this year with these weapons, right? He's going to throw so many touchdowns. To do that, you have to get into shootouts. You have to have 5+ TD games to get to 50 TDs. They've talked about kind of wanting to hold things back for the postseason at this stage of their multi-year run. And they didn't push Kelsey in routes last year, and they've talked about that element of it. I think they do some of the stuff they do with wide receiver usage because they're not as focused on the regular season relative to the postseason. They're kind of just toying with their food during the regular season, which matters for us in fantasy, but I don't think they're actually, endeavoring to go out and throw 50+ touchdowns in a season necessarily, which is somewhat relevant when we think through the real extreme ceiling outcomes. Mahomes looks really good in a baseline projection relative to anyone else because we know the pass rate over expected is going to be up there. It's been the top pass rate over expected 5 years running. We know that the efficiency is going to be there because Patrick Mahomes is incredible and the receiving core is improved. And yet I actually have some question marks about how his profile does hit a really elite ceiling that I find myself less asking about Stroud, because when I start to think about who could define this season, the Texans are at a place right now where they went and traded for Diggs, restructured him to a 1-year deal, gave up a second-round pick to make 2024 a year for them to go after it. And I feel like they're the team that goes out and tries to throw 50 touchdowns this year and put everyone on notice, even going into the playoffs. Dallas was kind of that team last year, I think, a little bit, where Mike McCarthy was like trying to win regular season awards because he was trying to prove that he was a better offensive play caller than Kellen Moore in some respects. I think, you see when the Bills got Diggs, the Bills were that team that season. They went out and they just really stretched their legs to see how good they could be offensively. Early Mahomes, his first year as a starter, the Chiefs were that team, right? 5,000 yards, 50 touchdowns. Early Lamar Jackson, Baltimore was that team. These teams that are having a lot of fun and trying to score as many points and trying to embarrass teams because they're becoming them who they're going to be in their next era. It gets almost a little bit.
The Chiefs guys stay healthy, though, which, I mean, there are some real concerns, I think, about like how many games you're really going to have Rice and Brown and Worthy all out there healthy and non-suspended and all of those kinds of things. But if they have that, like running preseason types of game plans, we could potentially still see him put up the big scores.
The thing I've been thinking about that is like he's going to throw 4 touchdowns. Like there's that year that he threw 4 touchdowns in the second quarter against the Raiders. He's going to throw 4 touchdowns in a first half quarter at some point this year. I'm basically worried about when they get up by 3 touchdowns, are they still going to be willing to throw the ball in the second half? And I don't think they really will. But like they might just score so many points in the first halves of the games that it doesn't matter. But yeah, I mean, that conversation about Stroud, I really buy into. The other reason I was laying that groundwork is Love and the Packers are that other team this year where you're like, this is the year for them to really, they were so good in the second half of last year statistically. Part of the issue with me for him is I don't come out with like a huge projection for him on yards and all of that. I do for passing TDs. I do have his pass TD rate really high, but they're a team that actually runs a relatively fewer plays at a little bit of a slower pace. I do have their pace elevating from last year, but obviously always under Rodgers as well, a more deliberate offense. And I do think
I wanted to ask you about both of these teams as you mentioned that, because every once in a while you get this little idea in the back of your head and it has nothing to do with anything. And it kind of sets you down this path of thinking, oh, there's this certain scenario that could play out. I was working through our NFL pace tool and it shows exactly what we were talking about, where with Rodgers and LaFleur, slowest team in football, easily the most plotting in terms of seconds to snap. It wasn't as much the case with Rodgers before that coaching change. Obviously we know there are things that Rodgers wants to do up there at the line and will continue to do those. You wonder a little bit in the back of your head how much some of the stuff he was doing was just controlling things he could control when he has this young head coach who obviously is good and is going to get into like multiple MVPs he should be thankful for, but also wants to assert his own authority in the situation.
Because he's Aaron Rodgers.
Right. Well, I mean, he's been known to be just like very easy to get along with. Yeah. So then you look at the Jets and the Packers. You have Rodgers injured last season. You have Jordan Love very much in his first season. And all these questions about if he'll even like remotely make it as a starting QB. You just mentioned the Cowboys situation. One of the reasons why I think that Dak Prescott, in addition to the fact that Prescott has bounced back and forth between being a star and being average from a fantasy perspective, is that we could see a little bit of that with the Cowboys go away now that they've made their point. Are we going to see more pace, or is it realistic to think we could see more pace from both the Packers and the Jets, but also just that they're going to try and push the scoring? Because on both sides of that, the people involved want to show that. It just feels like 2024 is going to have this Packers-Jets competition from afar, even as they go and try and accomplish their own separate objectives.
So this is the little thing that you've gotten in your head that you think both the Packers and Jets are going to be. This is their regular season to make a point, sort of a thing.
Right. And, obviously it doesn't have to manifest as like completely changing what they do pre-snap and play volume and that kind of thing. But I would expect both teams to try and run up the score.
I definitely am expecting that from the Jets. And I think Rodgers is going to like want to throw in the red zone. It's why I'm like a half notch below Bijan with Breece Hall. Cause I'm like, people have talked about how he barely got any, carries inside the 5-yard line, but Aaron Rodgers, I think Breece is actually going to catch a few touchdowns, but Rodgers is going to try and throw every touchdown he can. He's going to want it.
Ben Rodgers has said Breece Hall is his best target in the red zone.
Well, there you go. I projected him to have a very high receiving TD rate. I actually meaningfully thought through this exact point because Aaron Jones used to catch a lot of balls in close. There's a very I'm not out on Breece Hall. Let's be very clear. There's a very strong argument in favor of that. But I do think, what you were describing with Rodgers very much exists. And then he tries to throw 40 touchdowns this year, even if it hurts the team. He's going to try to throw in the red zone on situations where just giving the ball to Breece Hall is probably the optimal move. The Jordan Love thing, I guess so, but maybe it's like a weird like personality based thing, but the impression I get from Matt LaFleur is like he's just not wired that way. Like he's just very steady, and it's just like we're gonna take care of what we can control, and we're gonna do this. And I just, oh man, I don't know. Like it's a weird way of not getting in on Jordan Love, but because he's primarily a drop back passer who's not going to have much running value, you really have to believe that he can run a huge yardage total and pass TD rate. I have him for a pretty big pass TD rate, but the yardage stuff is where I'm like, I mean, maybe that's it. Maybe that's the part that I'm missing. I did move him up a little bit when I saw how high you had him, but yeah, you noted Burrow and Love up in that tier.
As it relates to your projections, how much does the potential for Love and the Packers to have a more aggressive target depth matter to where you come out on the passing yardage for these guys?
That's a good question. I do use ADOT in my projections, and I have him at a higher number. Love. I mean, really, I just need to be wrong on pass volume because I don't have them. I have them a little bit and plays per game. So it's plays per game and pass rate and how that manifests in pass volume. Because I have them about a half play per game below league average, which for a team with an above average win total, I would typically be above league average. So that's probably at least a play per game or a play and a half per game below what you'd expect. And then I have them at a pretty minor plus pass rate because that's the other side of it is pass rate over expected. Last year, they were at 0.002. The year prior, they were 3% to the negative. Now, okay, last year was Jordan Love's first year as a starter. The year prior, you had obviously still had Rodgers, so it's not really that relevant. But LaFleur's offenses have not tended to get to these big positive pass rates that Mahomes' offense will, and that I'm projecting Stroud's offense to get to, which it did. I want to see what Stroud's numbers were last year. So bear with me 1 second. So they were actually negative last year with Stroud, but I'm projecting that to pretty meaningfully jump back toward the positive, which is maybe not fair that I'm doing that for Houston, but for not for Green Bay. That's probably the part where you see the big difference in the yardage and the overall pass numbers that I'm more optimistic that Houston's going to get after it. And part of that's the Diggs acquisition and that kind of stuff. But you make a compelling case that Love could also be in that position. Now, as far as the projections based stuff, one thing I do want to note is I pay attention to the projections for quarterbacks more so than any other position by a mile. I do care about my projections at other positions, but the quarterback's projection is based on how I'm projecting all of the players. It goes back into the quarterback's numbers, and then I check that against their historical numbers as well to see if I'm way off. And if I'm way off, that I'm projecting an efficiency bump because I think this quarterback's in a better situation than he's ever been in. That kind of a situational, cross-checking would be notable. I'm not going to regress out, something that the projections are telling me that a quarterback's in a great spot. But the projections for me are typically going at the quarterback position are typically going to do the best job of reflecting, because we know the quarterbacks are going to play all the games. They're going to do the best job of reflecting my expectation on how good the offense is going to be and the market expectation, which I weigh heavily, and then how fast paced and all of those things that's stuff that I'm directly putting into my projections. So it's a little bit more clear for me. And then how the rushing work will manifest as well. So it's a little bit more clear to me when I look at the projections at QB that this is like how I think this guy's season will go in most cases, because this is what I think for the team. There's a lot more ambiguity with the different positions and the way that workload can be doled out and all of those things where you can just be wrong. But I could see being wrong on the Packers pass rate and play volume to that. And then that would meaningfully alter my Love projection and would meaningfully then change my perception of where he should rank. So, I mean, to that point. And another argument in that favor, Sean, is the division is a lot better and is going. I mean, we definitely like the Bears this year to be a lot better offensively. The Lions are like, I think, projected for the most total points in their games combined. Like they're going to give up points and they're going to score points, right? They're going to be a high scoring team, shootout situations. And Minnesota, as far as the worst team in the division goes, is one of the best worst teams in the division you could have for fantasy. They play in a dome. Kevin O'Connell definitely is willing to throw and can design a good offense. Even if their quarterback plays subpar, they could keep with you a little bit and push you a little bit offensively. So you could also make that argument in Love's case from a schedule standpoint that they have some potential shootouts that set up in that division.
And that kind of leads me to my next question, which is, and again, I mean, this is splitting hairs, but I think it's just so fun to talk through with you. In this sort of 9 through 14 range, you include Lawrence and Purdy with some of the guys we've been talking about. I like them. I think they are good plays. I think they're especially good plays in best ball, whereas when we do our main events, I would probably want to be targeting QBs that I expect more to explode from a full season perspective, as opposed to guys who fit really well in individual games complemented with a second QB. And that's one of the things that is a very real dynamic as we think through the differences between redraft and best ball, especially, if you're going for the big money, for example, is that as opposed to sort of a 2 QB attack where you're optimized, I mean, you need to have that guy because you're going to make a starting decision. For me, there's a group of QBs that is similar and compelling in Lawrence, Purdy, Tua, Goff. And I think that you can add Kirk Cousins to that, especially if we get over the next month continued vibes that he's pretty healthy. Whereas, I mean, Caleb Williams for me is on the other side of it, where you have this rushing potential and you have the 3 receivers. And
you mean that positively, to be clear,
right?
Because I initially heard that as negatively, but you mean that Caleb Williams is above that.
I think that there is a tier break between Williams and these players who, I mean, they're going to be good. They're going to be efficient. One of the things that's so interesting about Brock Purdy is that when you break down his passing expected points and then his passing fantasy points over expected, your initial take is, okay, this is completely unsustainable, right? There's no way that you can average basically a touchdown's worth of efficiency per game. And then you work through it and you realize that some of that is cutting back against his volume, simply because if you're that efficient with your passes, your drives end up being shorter because you're averaging over 10 yards per attempt. All of your receivers have these extraordinary yards per target. You go down there and you score touchdowns and you take the lead. And then at the end of the game, you're just like, it doesn't still work to have the volume. So I think you become less concerned that there is an efficiency problem with Purdy, because if the efficiency drops, it will be balanced out by the volume coming up to meet it. It's going to be.
I just tweeted this the other day, and I've pulled up my San Francisco projections. You're talking through it, and it's my number one note: play volume and efficiency intersect. You can't regress efficiency without more plays. I mean, I tweeted it the other day. It's the biggest mistake people make in projections. It's a really important point. I just want to emphasize.
And so, I mean, Purdy and Goff are going to score, and Tua is going to score, and Tua's in a situation where the Dolphins could end up with more passing touchdowns and fewer rushing touchdowns very easily without anything weird happening in terms of how they change their attack. But all of those guys, and then including Trevor Lawrence, appear to be at a level that you can win with, especially at the price, but you're not necessarily going to win because of. Whereas Caleb Williams, I mean, he gives you that potential to have a massive season, because if the designed runs are there and those 3 receivers break out, but one of the things that is difficult, and Pete and I were talking about this a little bit, I'm a little bit higher on Keenan Allen than some people, which makes me a little bit lower on DJ Moore and Roma Dunze than some people. But the main takeaway, and you and I both like Cole Kmet as well. We drafted him on our BBT the other day. I mean, the Bears are going to have one of the greatest receiver groups of all time,
right?
If their rookie receiver is as good as people think, or even if he's a little bit worse, right? I mean, they're going to have one of the greatest receiving groups ever, and a QB who's coming in as a generational prospect and has hybrid ability. That doesn't mean that he's going to hit and crush these guys, but I would wonder if his floor means you're probably not going to miss, but the win could be very substantial.
Yeah, I mean, I like this take. It's very similar to the Stroud one where I can't really defend not being higher on Caleb. I have Caleb listed as a target, and I don't have, Jordan Love or those guys listed as a target. I guess again, like Stroud, I felt like I was ahead of ADP enough to already be telling people to take Caleb by having him in a tier with Dak and Love and Burrow, who he tends to go behind. But I also have him with Lawrence and Purdy, who you mentioned specifically. And so to me, Purdy's a really interesting one because he's similar to Love. And for both, Love would be the other one where it's like, okay, you can't regress out efficiency without increasing play volume. And I do still have Love being very efficient, but maybe not quite efficient enough as I look at this. But Purdy's the other one that I have as very efficient. And to me, both of those quarterbacks are similar in the respect that they'll give you a little bit of mobility, but not a ton. They'll be very efficient, but maybe not actually get to throw a ton because I think both those coaches do in their hearts like to run a decent amount. But I'm projecting Purdy to be a really high level touchdown passer, right? And that's sort of the idea with Love too, is that you're running this high TD rate. Now, I think you've made a compelling case that Love's like breakout, define the season type upside could exist where the Packers are really going after something that I don't think probably exists for Purdy. So for Purdy, you're thinking more in terms of, yeah, he's going to be very efficient, but there's a cap to what they're actually going to push because of the way Kyle Shanahan is ultimately. Um, but yeah, I guess I think of Purdy and Love very similarly. So I'm pretty content having them in the same tier actually in that regard. As far as Caleb, because of the increased rushing I mean, obviously not going to disagree with you on what you're talking about with this receiving core. I mean, like DJ Moore's been a guy that I've loved from a talent perspective forever. Obviously, I haven't loved the ADP necessarily always. Keenan Allen, Sean, we both always loved. And then Ramadune says my UW guy that I've tried to defend all year and make you get higher on. So, I mean, if there's one person who would actually be higher on this receiving core than what you just said about it being the greatest group of all time, it might be me. So you might be talking to that person. I think this is an incredible receiving core, and similar to you, also include Cole Kmet in that. And so, yes, like how that can manifest for Caleb Williams could be massive. And I am like immediately like, okay, well, maybe I'm just too low on Caleb Williams when you say that. Not going to defend that either, or disagree with that either. Makes me want to move him up is sort of that my response there. But you also mentioned Trevor Lawrence, and I do want to go into him because he's the one that I also have noted as a target within this tier. And you mentioned why he should maybe be in that other group, and I agree with you about that other group and sort of where that there is a delineation there where like Kirk Cousins and those guys come in and they're intriguing in that next group, but they're in that next group. To me, Lawrence is above that pretty clearly because he does offer more mobility than I think people recognize. There's actually been some real production in his legs so far this year. We've talked about him a little bit on the show. I've probably already given this take, but some real production in his legs through 3 years and just a lack of production on the actual passing stuff overall so far. And I think they're setting him up to have the best year of his career in that regard. You've gotten me a little bit more into Brian Thomas and how he could influence. I think Gabe Davis is a positive influence on any offense he's in a way that I don't think he gets credit for. Fantasy managers hate him, but he's efficient when the targets come to him, and he's enough of a threat stretching vertically that he opens up things underneath. I think he improves the passing efficiency of the quarterback by being a real threat in the ways that he needs to be vertically, schematically, how that impacts the ways the defenses have to respect him. And if they don't respect him, that he will beat you deep. He's not Marcus Valdes-Scantling who won't make the play if you don't respect him, if you leave him in one-on-one coverage and you can't feel good throwing to him. You can feel good letting it loose to Gabe Davis in one-on-one coverage that he's going to go make a play most of the time. That doesn't mean that he's a target for me in fantasy because he's not, but he's a really useful piece. I think he was worth the contract. I've talked about this all offseason. So I do think this passing game really sets up well for Lawrence. And then the other side of that is if you, especially, Sean, I spend a lot more time on Twitter than you do, but if you listen to the film people talk about Lawrence, they always, without fail, emphasize that he's been let down by teammates essentially to this point in his career. There's been a lot of drops. There's a highlight reel that I think Ian Hartitz put together, which includes a lot of drops from Calvin Ridley last year, but it's just a lot of big plays that were just really well thrown balls that are just missed opportunities. I saw somebody tweet earlier today. I think it was Brent Coleman, perhaps, who's a big name in the YouTube space, but knows a lot of football. And he was like, if I had to wrap up my Trevor Lawrence film dive with one play, it would be this one. And he shows a play of Jamal Agnew. And again, if I'm attributing this tweet to the wrong person, I apologize. But Jamal Agnew running over the middle and Lawrence hitting him wide open, and he catches it, and then he gets hit right after that, and he fumbles. And it's like the whole thing about like the player fumbling right after the completion. The offensive line was kind of breaking down on the play. He's like the offensive line not really being there, but Lawrence still standing in there and delivering a good ball. And the fact that it's Jamal Agnew who's running your dig across the middle is like all of that is indicative of what Trevor Lawrence has had to deal with. I do pretty strongly believe that what we think of as Trevor Lawrence's sort of capped ceiling is not fair relative to what, he started his career with Urban Meyer, and then he's had a couple up and down questionable seasons with Doug Peterson. I think there's still a lot of upside in Trevor Lawrence's statistical ceiling when he does finally hit there. I've mentioned this stat before. He's never had more than 25 passing TDs in a year, which just seems like a fluke. Like he's going to have a 30 pass TD season at some point, in addition to the rushing production that I mentioned. And he actually adds some rushing touchdowns. I think he has the same type of profile that you described with Caleb Williams, actually. And so I'm pretty in on Lawrence being a part of that group as well. Like even redraft upside is, because I think you made a great delineation there. Even redraft upside to be the guy. I think I'm comfortable saying Lawrence has that.
And looking at the rushing EP numbers from last season, which are going to be a little bit different than looking at it through a different lens, and in some cases a little bit less accurate for the QBs who obviously are somewhat limited in the total number of attempts they're going to have. But we have kind of this stair step from Lawrence, and then you have that Love range in there with Stroud also being a little bit interesting, and then another meaningful step down to where we get with Tua and Goff and Purdy, which I think you can dream a little bit, especially maybe about a Jordan Love with his size and mobility. Whereas, it would be very surprising if we got a different profile from a rushing perspective with Goff and Purdy and Tua. They just have to do it completely through the air. And the thing that you always note, which is just, even a couple of points, right? If you're talking about like 1.5 points added through rushing that you don't have to get as a passer over the course of an entire season, it does change then the total number of points you get, but also then your individual game types of upside. I think a little bit for me with Trevor Lawrence, it's been, I have this concern that even though his teammates have let him down, when you watch them play, he gets rid of the ball so fast that, there are a lot of plays where you're like, just let one of your guys get open, right? Mm-hmm. You don't have to take the initial read and rocket it out there even somewhat accurately if you had a better opportunity. And then the other element, I would agree with you on some of the things people are saying, which is that when you dive into the SIS numbers, you see some of the things that they've done with charting. He actually looks a little bit better as opposed to a little bit worse, right? I'm hopeful on that Brian Thomas selection. And I do think it's something where Brian Thomas is going to fit in that group where you need to be patient. But when he has the massive breakout last year, when he looks almost unstoppable athletically, when his complementary role to Malik Neighbors is so explosive, I think you can dream on that as that once he gets a little bit less overshadowed, once he has some of these things to himself, once he's dealing with guys like Gabe Davis and Christian Kirk, who are good players, but are probably just not even in the range that Malik Neighbors already will be as a rookie and never are going to be in that type of range, that he would look like the guy. Again, you have to be patient on some of these things, but certainly the real upside case for him, and then I think it is tied to Lawrence, would be him immediately generating rave reviews in camp. He's come on pretty slowly to this point.
Yeah. We're not getting that. And that gets back to some of the concerns I've talked about since prospect season, where the consistency is what I tend to believe that I see in the targets per out run numbers, and it never really manifesting. It's like you got to be consistent to win at wide receiver is sort of like my one biggest rule. And that's why I love targets per round as a stat, because I think it shows you a degree of consistency in addition to, needing a lot of context and a lot of other things. But yeah, I have been thinking the same about the early Brian Thomas reports from camp that we might get a little bit of a slow developing thing. But I still think even like if he's not a massive piece, I still think there's the potential that, because I do think Gabe Davis influences the passing efficiency positively. Like I mean that statement. And so then Brian Thomas is like the other half of that that's improving things. And you have Kirk and you have Ingram. I still think there's paths for Lawrence to have a really strong season. Maybe that's crazy, but he's the guy that I haven't been willing to like budge on, as I've heard some concerning stuff where their offense hasn't looked great early in camp. I'm just like, I think the ceiling is there. If Lawrence and the Jags kind of have their best version of their season that they can have, I think he can be like a weekly top 5 quarterback, basically, statistically speaking. And so that's when you talk about like the redraft element where we're like, yeah, we're just plugging in Trevor Lawrence every week. We feel great about it. It doesn't mean that he's my favorite of all the options in that regard. But I do think that there's some real meaningful upside to him where you can get him, especially. Shawn, you wrote up Geno Smith recently, and I sent you a note, and we talked about him. We talked about the Seahawks as an exciting team. You had mentioned DK Metcalf and JSN already. He's another one. As we go into like the even later tiers that I want to mention as a fun later round QB target, we both are higher than market on Bo Nix, which won't surprise anybody. Your boy Justin Fields is looking like he has a shot to start week 1. I loved your comment earlier in the offseason that there was a bigger gap between Justin Fields and Russell Wilson than there was between Russell Wilson and you at being able to play quarterback. And look, like, yes, Russell Wilson's been hurt and nothing else has really changed other than Russell Wilson's not practicing. But that's essentially what you were saying, is that once Justin Fields gets out there on the practice field, people are going to be like, I mean, he's just a lot better. And you're seeing that from all the beat reporters are like, wow, I mean, didn't realize this Justin Fields guy is so big, athletic, and has such a cannon arm and is so accurate. Like this is kind of cool. All I've ever heard about him is that he, holds the ball too long and takes too many sacks. It does seem like the winds are shifting. There's in these articles now, there's been a lot of speculation that, well, if Fields does beat him out, maybe they'll just cut Wilson. Like it's almost this idea that we're going to get going into week 1. They're going to release Wilson. There was another report that they really only felt like they had to put Wilson in as the number 1 early in minicamp because they felt like that was the way to manage him. But all of these reports are sort of saying that it's more of an open competition, and it was more of an open competition than it sounded like. A lot of their other reporting had made it sound like Wilson was pretty clearly going to be the number 1 starter, and the starter in week 1, the number 1 guy. And then he gets a little banged up, and suddenly all these other reports are like, well, no, the door's always been open, and Russell Wilson also might not even make the team. And so it's starting to become kind of interesting. Justin Fields is going to quickly become one of the more intriguing late round quarterbacks